Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi ta'ala wabarakatuh. Okay, we are going to look at audit sampling. How auditor use audit sampling in the performance of his audit work. In this video, I am going to cover audit sampling. The definition of the audit sampling according to ISA 530. And then I'm going to talk about the types of statistical and non-statistical sampling. Third, I'm going to talk about the risk associated with these types of sampling. And finally, how the audit sampling affects the auditor's work performance. How the audit sampling is defined. According to the International Standards on Auditing 530 or ISA 530, audit sampling is defined as the application of audit procedure by auditor to less than 100% of items within a population of audit relevance, and that all sampling units have an equal chance of selection. And this is actually for auditor to provide a reasonable basis on which to draw conclusion about the entire population. Before we go into detail what audit sampling is, let's look at the important terms in sampling. First, the population. So what is population? It's actually the entire set of data from which a sample is selected and about which the auditor wishes to draw conclusion. Next, stratification. This is where the population is divided into a similar characteristic, and each population is a group of sampling unit. Okay, the third one is sampling unit. Sampling unit is the individual item constituting a population. Example, sampling unit might be checks listed in checks logbook, credit entries on bank statement, sales invoices, or debtors balances. Okay, the next term that you need to know is that the statistical sampling and non-statistical sampling. So there are actually two types of sampling. Statistical, it means that these are the statistical sampling is the scientific method of selecting a sample unit. And non-statistical, it means that the auditor here use his judgment in selecting the sample. Let's look at the statistical sampling. How this is different from the non-statistical sampling. For a statistical sampling, the sample that has been selected has two characteristics. One is where the items selected to be in the sample are randomly selected from the population. And for the statistical sampling, the use of the probability theory to evaluate the sample result and to calculate the sampling risk. Non-statistical sampling, on the other hand, does not have the two characteristics as in the statistical sampling. It means that the sample units for a non-statistical sampling are not randomly selected, and to evaluate the result and to determine the sampling risk is not using the probability theory. And the non-statistical sampling is where auditor use his judgment to select the sample based on certain criteria or based on the risk that the auditor perceives. Let's look at the sample selection methods in general. There are a few types of sample selection. One is random selection, where the items to be included in the sample are selected randomly using the number generator or using the random number table. Another type of selection is systematic selection, where there is a system of selecting or structured technique of selecting the sample. An example is given here. And then the next sampling method is based on the monetary unit. So that's the third one. Haphazard selection. Okay, this is actually opposite to the random selection where there is no structured technique of selecting the sample. And lastly, the block selection. Block selection is where the auditor select blocks of contiguous items from within the population. Let's look at now the effect of audit sampling on auditor. Auditor will usually carry out audit procedures on audit sampling. The auditor will collect a representative sample units from the population, and auditor will perform tests on these sampling units. The result from this test will define the characteristic of the sampling units. And this characteristic will be used to infer to be the characteristic of the population. Okay, to infer the characteristic of the sampling unit to be the characteristic of the population, the auditor must make sure that he has selected a representative sample. It means that he has to extract the sampling unit from the population that are representative or have the same characteristic of the population. Otherwise, the result that he is going to infer to the population may be inappropriate. The auditor can use audit sampling either using non-statistical sampling or using the statistical sampling. In selecting the sampling units, there will always be sampling risk. Sampling risk is a situation where the auditor infer the characteristic of the population wrongly or inappropriately. And the reason is because the sample that the auditor has selected may not be representative of the population. There are two types of sampling risk. The first one is where we say type 1 sampling risk, and the second one is type 2 sampling risk. What is type 1? Type 1 is where in a situation where auditor carried out the test of control, the auditor concludes that the internal controls are less effective or not effective than they actually are. In relation to tests of detail on the financial statements, the auditor may inappropriately conclude that there are or there is a material misstatement exists in the financial statements when in fact it does not exist. Now this sampling risk, type 1 sampling risk, will affect the audit efficiency because the auditor has to carry out additional audit procedure to determine that there are no material misstatements. In a type 2 error, it's a situation where the auditor conclude the opinion on the internal controls or in relation to the financial statements favorably. For instance, in the case of test of control, the auditor conclude that the internal controls are functioning effectively and adequately than they actually are. And in relation to the test of detail, the auditor concludes that the material misstatement does not exist when in fact the material misstatement exists. Okay, in this type 2 error, this is actually significant to the auditor. Auditor has to make sure that he did not make this type 2 error because it can seriously affect his audit effectiveness, and it could also um, lead him to giving an inappropriate audit opinion. Non-sampling risk, on the other hand, is a situation where the auditor gives inappropriate audit opinion or conclusion, and this is not related at all to the sampling unit. The reason for the non-sampling risk might be due to a situation where the auditor must or might have applied inappropriate audit procedures to the sampling unit, or the auditor has interpreted wrongly the results from the audit procedure that had been carried out on the sampling units, or it could be that the auditor failed to recognize the misstatement in the sampling units. Let's look at the relationship between risk and sample size. Okay, the auditor will be assessing the risk of the client's internal controls and the client's financial statements, whether there are material misstatement or no material misstatement. So if the auditor assesses that higher risk in this internal control system and the financial statement, the auditor would increase the sample size or having a bigger sample size. And the reason is for auditor to obtain more assurance about the effectiveness of the internal control, and also for auditor to be more assured that there is lower risk of material misstatement in the financial statements. Okay, and then on the other hand, if let's say the auditor consider that the risk in the internal controls and in the financial statements are lower or tolerable, or he can accept that, then he may only select a smaller sample size, or he can reduce the sample size. The reason is because he has confidence now that there might be lower material misstatement in the financial statement, or there is no material misstatement. Also, he is confident that the internal controls of the system are functioning effectively. Thank you for listening. Assalamualaikum.